Bellamy's Bakery occupied a weathered brick corner in the part of town where rent was cheap and dreams were expensive. The kind of establishment that had survived 3 recessions and 2 ownership changes, holding on through sheer stubborn will and the loyalty of neighbors who remembered when bread cost a quarter. It had wooden floors that creaked in certain spots, glass display cases that bore the fingerprints of 1,000 children's noses, and the scent of vanilla and butter that seemed baked into the very walls. The afternoon sun slanted through the large front windows, turning dust motes into tiny dancers and casting everything in that particular golden light that made even the simplest cupcake look like something from a magazine. Inside, behind the counter, Mrs. Bellamy was arranging a fresh batch of croissants when the little girl pushed through the heavy door. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with light brown hair that fell just past her shoulders in waves that looked like someone had tried, and mostly failed, to tame them that morning. She wore a faded pink dress, the kind that had been washed so many times the color had softened from rose to something closer to dusty salmon, and it hung a bit loose on her small frame, as if it had been bought with room to grow into. In her right hand, clutched against her chest with both palms wrapped around it protectively, was a crumpled $5 bill. Her eyes, hazel, serious, and far too knowing for someone who still lost teeth, swept across the bakery with the careful assessment of a person who understood that beautiful things often cost more than you could afford. She moved slowly toward the display cases, her worn sneakers making soft squeaking sounds on the old wood floor, as if she were approaching something sacred, as if she knew that what happened in the next few minutes mattered more than anything else in her small world.
Mrs. Bellamy had run this bakery for 23 years, long enough to read people by the way they entered. This child moved like someone who had learned early that disappointment was common, that hoping too hard could hurt you, but that sometimes, just sometimes, if you were very careful and very brave, good things might happen anyway. "Hello, sweetheart," Mrs. Bellamy said, her voice gentle as she came around the counter, wiping flour dust from her apron. "What can I help you find today?" The little girl looked up at her with those 2 serious eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was small but carried the weight of a mission that could not fail. "I need to buy a birthday cake," she said. "It's for my mama. Tomorrow's her birthday, and I want to get her something really special, something perfect." Mrs. Bellamy felt her heart do that particular squeeze that happened when children tried so hard to do grown-up things. "Well, that's very thoughtful of you. What's your name, honey?" "Nilo," the girl said. "My mama's name is Irene." "That's a beautiful name. Both of them are." Mrs. Bellamy smiled. "So tell me, Nilo, what kind of cake does your mama like?"
"Chocolate," Nilo answered without hesitation, as if she'd been preparing for this question for weeks. "She loves chocolate. And flowers. She used to have flowers on our table when I was little, before—" She trailed off, then started again. "So, maybe a cake with flowers? Like the kind that are made of frosting?" She paused, and Mrs. Bellamy watched the girl's fingers tighten around the $5 bill. "But I only have $5, Nilo added quietly, holding up the money as if it were a fortune, which Mrs. Bellamy suspected it was. Every penny of it saved from somewhere, somehow, by a child who shouldn't have to worry about money at all. Mrs. Bellamy's chest tightened. The cheapest cake in her shop was $30, and that was for something basic, nothing special. A proper birthday cake with chocolate layers and buttercream flowers, the kind that would make a tired mother's eyes light up, that ran at least $75, sometimes $80 depending on size. But looking at this child's face, at the desperate hope barely masked by careful politeness, Mrs. Bellamy couldn't bring herself to say the words that would crush that hope. "Let me see what we can figure out," she said instead, buying time. "Why don't you look at all the cakes and tell me which one you think would make your mama happiest?" Nilo approached the display case like it was a museum, pressing close to the glass, her breath fogging it slightly as she studied each creation with the intense focus of someone making the most important decision of their life. She moved past the simple sheet cakes, past the cupcakes, past the fruit tarts, until she stopped in front of a 2-layer chocolate masterpiece that sat on the middle shelf like a crown jewel. It had smooth dark chocolate ganache coating the outside, with delicate buttercream flowers in shades of cream and soft pink cascading down one side and tiny edible pearls scattered across the top like morning dew. "That one," Nilo breathed, her small hand reaching out to touch the glass in front of it, leaving behind a tiny fingerprint. "That's the one. That's perfect for Mama." Mrs. Bellamy looked at the cake Nilo had chosen and felt her heart sink. That particular cake was a special order, made for a woman celebrating her retirement, scheduled for pickup in less than 2 hours. It had taken Mrs. Bellamy 3 hours to decorate, and it cost exactly $80. She was opening her mouth, trying to find words that would be kind but honest, trying to figure out how to redirect this earnest child to something more realistic without breaking her heart entirely, when the bell above the door chimed. The man who walked in brought with him the smell of expensive cologne and the aura of someone who lived in a different world entirely. He was in his early 40s, tall, with dark hair that had begun to silver at the temples in that way that made some men look distinguished rather than old. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Mrs. Bellamy made in a month, perfectly tailored, with a crisp white shirt and a tie in a muted blue that matched his eyes. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, but it was his face that told the real story. It would have been handsome. Strong jaw, straight nose, the kind of features that belonged on magazine covers, if it hadn't looked so exhausted, so empty. There were shadows under his eyes that spoke of too many late nights and not enough reasons to come home. His expression was carefully neutral, the kind of mask people wore when they'd forgotten what it felt like to genuinely smile. He moved through the bakery like someone going through motions, not really seeing anything, just following a script he'd written for himself. Go to bakery, buy something sweet, return to empty apartment, repeat tomorrow. Mrs. Bellamy recognized that look. It was loneliness wearing expensive clothes. The man didn't notice Nilo at first. He walked to a different display case, studying the pastries with the kind of detachment that suggested he didn't actually care what he ordered. But Nilo noticed him. She turned away from the cake, from her dreams of surprising her mother, and stared at this stranger in his beautiful suit and sad eyes. She tilted her head, studying him the way she'd studied the cakes, seeing something the adults had stopped looking for. Mrs. Bellamy watched as Nilo took a small step toward the man, still clutching her $5 bill, and did something that would change 3 lives forever. "Mister," Nilo said, her voice cutting through the quiet bakery like a bell. "Why do your eyes look so sad?" The man froze, his hand halfway to pointing at an eclair. He turned slowly, looking down at the small girl in the faded pink dress, and for just a moment, just a flicker, his careful mask slipped. And in that moment, standing in a bakery that smelled of butter and sugar and broken dreams, a CEO who had everything and a little girl who had almost nothing saw each other for exactly what they were. 2 people who understood what it meant to ache for something money couldn't buy. Neither of them knew it yet, but the answer to Nilo's question would take the rest of the story to unfold, and it would begin with a cake, $5, and the rarest currency of all, the courage to be honest about being alone. Wondergan Scott had entered Bellamy's bakery the way he did everything these days, on autopilot, going through motions that had stopped meaning anything years ago. He'd been driving home from the office, the leather seats of his Mercedes cold against his back despite the heated function, when he'd felt that familiar hollow ache that no amount of success seemed to fill. Sweet, he'd thought. Something sweet might help. It never did, but he kept trying anyway, as if sugar could substitute for the sweetness missing from his life. At 42, he was everything he'd set out to become. CEO of Scott Development, the man who'd transformed the city's skyline with gleaming towers of steel and glass. His penthouse apartment looked like something from an architecture magazine, all clean lines and expensive art, and windows that showcased a view most people would kill for. His office occupied the entire top floor of his flagship building, a monument to achievement with its mahogany desk and walls covered in awards, and framed articles calling him a visionary, a titan, a force of nature. But monuments were just expensive tombstones, and tonight, his 42nd birthday, he'd realized he had no one to call. Not one person who would care enough to ask how his day had been, let alone remember what day it was.
So he'd come to a bakery in a neighborhood his company had considered buying and redeveloping, looking for something sweet to take home to his empty apartment where he'd eat it alone and pretend it was enough. He was reaching for an eclair, his hand already extended toward the display case when he heard it. A small voice faltering, hope draining out of words the way water drains from cupped hands. He glanced over and saw her, a little girl in a faded pink dress, staring at a cake she clearly couldn't afford, her shoulders beginning to slump in a way that spoke of disappointment she'd learned too young. For a moment, Lundergan felt something crack inside his chest. Something he'd thought had calcified years ago. Then the girl turned toward him, and he found himself looking into hazel eyes that seemed to see straight through his expensive suit and polished shoes into the wasteland beneath. "Mister," she said with devastating directness, "why are your eyes so sad?" Lundergan froze. In boardrooms, people deferred to him. At charity galas, they flattered him. In business negotiations, they feared or respected him. But no one, not in years, maybe decades, had actually seen him, really seen him. "Are you alone?" the girl continued, tilting her head slightly as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Is that why you look like that? Like you're here, but you're not really here?" He should leave. Should make some excuse about being in a hurry, buy his pastry, and get back to his carefully constructed life, where children didn't ask questions that stripped away every defense he'd built. But those eyes, honest, unjudging, simply curious, demanded truth in a way that made lying feel impossible. Lundergan found himself kneeling slowly, his custom-tailored suit bending at the knees, expensive fabric touching the worn wooden floor, until he was eye level with this remarkable child who'd seen what no one else had bothered to look for. "Yes," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "I forgot how to be happy." The admission shocked him. He hadn't meant to say it, hadn't even fully acknowledged it to himself until this moment. But there it was, spoken aloud in a bakery that smelled of butter and sugar, to a 6-year-old girl who clutched $5 like treasure. Nilo nodded solemnly, as if adults confessing to forgotten happiness was the most natural thing in the world. "That's really sad," she said. "Do you want to be happy again?" Did he? Lundergan had been so focused on building, achieving, acquiring that he'd stopped asking himself what he actually wanted. Happiness seemed like something from another lifetime, something he traded away for success without quite realizing the exchange rate. "I don't know if I remember how," he admitted, surprising himself again with honesty. Nilo considered this seriously, as if he'd presented her with a complex problem requiring careful thought. Then her face brightened slightly. "Maybe you need a cake," she suggested. "Cakes make people happy. That's why I'm getting one for my mama, because she works really hard and she's always tired. But when she sees something beautiful, she smiles. A real smile, not the kind she does when she's just being brave." Lundergan felt something twist in his chest. Recognition, perhaps, of another person wearing brave smiles over deep exhaustion. "Maybe I do need a cake," he said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that might have been a real smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Maybe that's exactly what I need." Lundergan looked at this small girl with her $5 bill and her impossible dream, and something shifted inside him, something that felt suspiciously like purpose. He'd spent 20 years making deals that moved millions of dollars, that changed city skylines, that made shareholders wealthy beyond measure. But standing in this neighborhood bakery watching a child's heart break over $80, he suddenly understood that all those deals had been empty transactions. This, though, this mattered. "I have an idea," he said, his voice taking on the tone he used when proposing mergers that would reshape entire industries. Let's be partners. Nilo looked up at him, her head tilting in confusion. Partners? Yes, a business partnership. He gestured between them. You give me your $5 and I'll cover the rest. We'll both be investors in this cake. You take it to your mama. That's your return on investment. And I'll take the memory of helping you make her birthday special. That's mine. He watched her process this, saw the wheels turning behind those hazel eyes that had already seen too much of life's harsh mathematics. She was trying to figure out if this was charity dressed up as business, if accepting would mean she'd failed somehow. It's a fair trade, Lundergan added quietly. You're giving me something I need just as much as I'm giving you something you need. That's what good partnerships are. Both sides get what they're looking for. Nilo considered this with the gravity of a boardroom executive weighing a multi-million-dollar contract. She looked down at her crumpled $5 bill, then up at the cake, then back at Lundergan's face, searching for any hint of pity or condescension. She must have found only honesty, because she nodded slowly, then carefully, ceremonially, placed her $5 on the counter. Her small hands smoothed the wrinkled bill flat, pressing out each crease with the reverence of someone signing their name to something important. Deal, she said solemnly. We're partners. Lundergan pulled out his credit card and handed it to Mrs. Bellamy, who'd been watching this exchange with eyes that had gone suspiciously bright. She ran the card, then reached under the counter and pulled out a small box of butter cookies, the expensive kind she usually saved for special occasions. For the partner investors, she said, her voice warm with approval. Every good business deal deserves a celebration. As Mrs. Bellamy carefully boxed the cake, wrapping it in white paper tied with string, Lundergan felt something unfamiliar spreading across his face. It took him a moment to recognize it, a real smile, the kind that came from somewhere genuine instead of from the practice charm he deployed at networking events. The transaction had cost him $75, barely enough to cover lunch at the restaurants he frequented, but standing here watching Nilo's eyes light up as Mrs. Bellamy presented the boxed cake like a treasure, he felt wealthier than any quarterly earnings report had ever made him feel. Thank you, Mr. Nilo trailed off, realizing she didn't know his name. Scott, he said. Lundergan Scott. She tried the name out, her small voice wrapping around the syllables. Thank you, Mr. Scott. This is the best business deal I ever made. Me too, Lundergan said, and meant it. Nilo studied him with those eyes that saw too much. Do you have a family, Mr. Scott? The question landed like a punch to his solar plexus. No, he admitted. I don't. Her eyes widened, filling with something that looked like genuine distress. No family at all? Not even for your birthday? It's your birthday, Mrs. Bellamy interjected, pausing in her wrapping. Today? Lundergan nodded reluctantly, wishing he hadn't let that slip. 42 today? Nilo's face transformed from distress to determination, the same expression she'd worn when deciding which cake was perfect for her mama. She made the kind of decision that only children can make, simple, immediate, and utterly certain. Well, now you do have a family, she announced. Me and Mama, you have to come to Mama's party tomorrow. You can't be alone on your birthday. That's the saddest thing ever, and we're partners now. So we have to take care of each other. Lundergan opened his mouth to refuse. This had gone far enough. He'd helped, yes, but showing up at a stranger's home, inserting himself into their lives, that was too much, too strange, too complicated. But before he could form the words, Nilo's small hand was wrapping around his sleeve, tugging him toward the door with surprising strength. Come on, partner, she said. "I'll show you where we live. Mama gets off work at 7, so the party's at 7:30. You have to come. Partners stick together." And Lundergan Scott, who commanded boardrooms full of powerful executives, who'd never backed down from a negotiation in his life, found himself utterly unable to resist the determined pull of a 6-year-old girl who'd decided he belonged to a family now. Lundergan watched Nilo hoist the cake box against her chest, her small arms barely able to wrap around it, and felt something protective surge through him. "Let me walk you home," he said. "That's too heavy for you to carry alone." Nilo beamed up at him. "Okay, partner." They stepped out of the bakery into afternoon light that had gone golden and long, casting shadows across streets Lundergan recognized from zoning maps and development proposals, but had never actually walked. His driver, Marcus, was already pulling the black Mercedes town car to the curb, trained to anticipate his needs. But Lundergan waved him off. "I'll call when I need you." Marcus's eyebrows rose. In 12 years of employment, Lundergan had never dismissed him. But he nodded and pulled away. The neighborhood revealed itself in details he'd never noticed from the back seat of his car. Sidewalks cracked and heaved by tree roots, graffiti blooming across boarded windows, men lingering on corners with the particular stillness of those who had nowhere else to be. Buildings that had been beautiful once, their architectural bones still visible beneath decades of neglect. This was the part of the city his developments had bypassed, the areas his company had deemed not yet viable for investment, which meant not profitable enough to care about. Nilo chattered as they walked, utterly unconscious of any danger. "Mama works at Sacred Heart Hospital," she explained. "She cleans the rooms after sick people leave. She has to make everything super clean so the next sick people don't get more sick. It's important work," she says, even if nobody sees her do it. "That is important work," Lundergan agreed and meant it. And then she goes to Joe's Diner and works there from 6 until really late, sometimes midnight, sometimes later if someone doesn't show up. Nilo shifted the cake box and Lundergan gently took it from her, carrying it himself. She smiled up at him gratefully. "She's tired all the time, like all the time. She falls asleep on the couch in her uniform because she's too tired to change." Lundergan's throat constricted. "That sounds very hard." "Her hands get really dry from all the cleaning chemicals," Nilo continued matter-of-factly. "They crack and sometimes bleed a little. So when she falls asleep, I put lotion on them, the kind that smells like coconut. I got it at the dollar store with my bottle money before I started saving for the cake." The image hit Lundergan like a physical blow. This small child, this 6-year-old girl, gently rubbing lotion into her mother's chemically ravaged hands while she slept. The tenderness of it, the role reversal, the quiet heroism of a child trying to heal the woman who was breaking herself to provide. They reached a building with peeling paint and a warped doorframe. The intercom panel hung by wires, long since given up on. Inside, the stairwell smelled of old cooking and dampness. The walls had been painted institutional beige sometime in the distant past, now marked with scuffs and water stains. At apartment 4C, Nilo knocked in a specific pattern. 3 quick raps, 1 slow, 2 quick. Their code, Lundergan realized. Their way of saying, "It's me, it's safe." The door opened immediately, as if the person inside had been waiting right there. The woman who appeared was younger than Lundergan had expected, 30 at most, though exhaustion had etched lines around her eyes that made her seem older. She wore a janitor's uniform, the kind with her name embroidered on the chest. Irene, her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, strands escaping around her face. Her hands resting on the doorframe were exactly as Nilo had described. Red, chapped, the skin cracked at the knuckles. But it was her eyes that struck him, dark brown and wary, with the particular guardedness of someone who'd learned that surprise visitors rarely brought good news. "Mama," Nilo shouted, her voice exploding with pride. "I got your cake. Well, me and my partner did." Irene's gaze went from the cake box to her daughter's glowing face, to the tall man in the expensive suit standing in her doorway. Lundergan watched her expression shift in real time, confusion, then assessment, then wariness sharpening into fear. She pulled Nilo behind her with one protective hand, her body blocking the doorway. "Nilo, baby," she said, her voice tight and controlled. "Step inside, right now." Lundergan's hands went up immediately, palms out and visible, the universal gesture of surrender. He took a half step back, putting more distance between himself and the protective mother in the doorway. "Mrs. Garcia," she cut him off, her voice hard as granite. "Irene Garcia." She pulled Nilo more firmly behind her, one hand gripping her daughter's shoulder. "Who are you and why are you with my daughter?" "Mama, it's okay," Nilo protested, trying to peer around her mother's body. "He's my partner. He helped me buy your cake." But Irene wasn't listening. Her eyes were scanning Lundergan with the practiced assessment of someone who'd learned to evaluate threats quickly. He watched her take inventory, the suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, the watch that could cover a year of groceries, the shoes polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him screamed money, power, and a world so far removed from this hallway that his presence here could only mean trouble. Lundergan stayed exactly where he was, keeping his body language open and non-threatening. "I'm Lundergan Scott," he said, his voice calm and level. "I was in Bellamy's bakery when your daughter came in trying to buy a cake with $5. The cake she wanted cost $80. I helped her cover the difference. That's all. I walked her home to make sure she got here safely with it." Irene's jaw tightened. "We don't need charity." The words came out clipped, defensive, loaded with the pride of someone who'd fought too hard for too long to accept handouts now. "It wasn't charity," Lundergan said carefully, keeping his voice gentle. "We're partners. She contributed $5. I contributed the rest. A fair business arrangement. She gets the cake for you. I get—" He paused, realizing how strange it would sound. "I get the satisfaction of helping. That's the deal we made." Nilo wriggled free from her mother's grip and held up the cake box like evidence in a trial. "Mama, please don't be mad. I paid my part. All $5 I saved. And he was sad and alone in the bakery, just like us sometimes. He looked so lonely, Mama. I invited him to your party so he wouldn't have to be alone on his birthday. That's okay, right? We help people who are lonely." Something in Irene's posture shifted slightly. She looked down at her daughter. This child who'd somehow saved $5 while they were barely making rent, who'd walked into a bakery alone on a mission, who'd seen a stranger's sadness and responded with kindness instead of fear. Her eyes moved to the box from Bellamy's, the expensive bakery she'd walked past 100 times but never entered. She noticed the smaller box of cookies tucked under Lundergan's arm. She noticed how he'd stayed in the hallway, how his hands were still partially raised, how he hadn't made any move to push his way in or assert any kind of authority. She looked at his face, really looked, and saw exhaustion that matched her own. Different kind, maybe, but just as real. Irene sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of a double shift and 6 years of single motherhood and the bone-deep weariness of never having enough. "I just got off a double shift, Nilo. We don't have much for a party. I don't even know if there's food in the—" "We have cake," Nilo interrupted, her voice bright with determination. "That's all we need for a party. Cake and people who care about each other." Lundergan made a decision. "I could order pizza," he offered. "My treat. Partners should celebrate together, right? And it's both your birthdays we're celebrating. Yours tomorrow, mine today." Irene wanted to refuse. Every instinct demanded she send this stranger away and protect what little independence she had left. But then she looked at Nilo's face, lit up with joy and hope. Her daughter had saved $5, had walked to a bakery alone, had somehow convinced a wealthy stranger to help her. "Fine," she said, the word coming out reluctantly. "But just pizza, nothing fancy. And you eat and then you go. Understood?" She stepped aside, opening the door wider but still blocking most of the entrance with her body. The apartment revealed itself in stages, Tiny, maybe 400 square feet, but meticulously clean. A studio with a faded curtain strung across one corner to create Nilo's sleeping area. Furniture that didn't match but had been arranged with care. Medical bills stacked on the counter in careful piles. Next to them, a budget written in neat handwriting, every dollar accounted for. On a shelf made from cinder blocks and a plank of wood sat a single framed photograph. Baby Nilo, maybe a year old, held by a younger Irene whose face held a lightness that had long since been ground away. No father in the frame, no father anywhere in evidence. Lundergan took it all in. The poverty, yes, but also the dignity. The struggle, but also the love evident in every carefully maintained corner. "Happy birthday, Irene," Lundergan said quietly, meeting her eyes with respect instead of pity. "I hope you don't mind an uninvited guest." Lundergan pulled out his phone and called Marcus. "I need you to pick up pizza, 2 large, 1 pepperoni, 1 cheese, an ice cream, vanilla and chocolate, and..." He paused as Nilo tugged his sleeve, whispering urgently. He bent down to listen. "Sparkling cider," she breathed. "Mama likes bubbles, but we can't afford the fancy kind usually." "And sparkling cider," Lundergan repeated into the phone. "The good kind, 30 minutes. While they waited, Nilo gave Lundergan a tour that took approximately 15 seconds, pointing out her room behind the curtain, the kitchen area where she did homework, the couch where Mama sometimes fell asleep. She showed him her school papers stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, all marked with stars and smiley faces. Irene emerged from behind the curtain in jeans and a faded sweater, her hair released from its ponytail, and Lundergan saw clearly what exhaustion had obscured before. She was beautiful. Young and worn down, yes, but beautiful in the way of people who'd refused to break, despite every reason to. When Marcus arrived with the food, Nilo helped set everything up on the coffee table while Irene retrieved mismatched plates from the kitchen. That's when Lundergan noticed the decorations. A banner strung across the window that proclaimed "Happy Bitter Dia" in uneven letters. Some backwards, clearly hung by a 6-year-old's determined hands. Nilo saw him looking and beamed with pride. "I put those up this morning before school. Do you like them?" "They're perfect," Lundergan said, his throat tight. They sat on the floor around the coffee table because there weren't enough chairs, eating pizza from paper plates. Nilo dominated the conversation with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a child who'd found a captive audience, telling elaborate stories about her teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, who wore earrings as big as donuts and had once accidentally sat in purple paint during art class. Lundergan found himself laughing, actually laughing the kind that came from his belly instead of from polite social obligation. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like this. Across the table, Irene's lips curved into a small smile, her guard dropping incrementally. For the first time in years, Lundergan wasn't checking his phone. He was just here, sitting on a worn carpet in a tiny apartment, and somehow this moment felt more real than anything in his carefully constructed life. When the pizza was gone and everyone had eaten too much ice cream, Nilo announced it was time for cake. She made her mother close her eyes. "No peeking, Mama. This has to be perfect." She carried the bakery box to the table, set it down carefully, and slowly, so slowly, lifted the lid. "Okay, Mama, open." Irene opened her eyes and went absolutely still. The cake sat there in all its glory. 2 layers of dark chocolate perfection, buttercream flowers in cream and pink cascading down one side, tiny edible pearls scattered across the top. It was easily the most expensive, most beautiful thing in the entire apartment. For a moment, no one moved. Then Irene's face crumpled. She cried the way people cry when something breaks open inside them, deep, heaving sobs that shook her shoulders, tears streaming down her face unchecked. Not the quiet tears she probably shed in secret, but raw, uncontrolled weeping that came from a place beyond exhaustion. Nilo scrambled into her mother's lap, alarmed. "Mama, don't cry. I wanted you to be happy." "I am happy, baby," Irene managed between sobs. "I'm so happy. This is, her voice broke. This is the most beautiful thing anyone's ever done for me. 3 months, Nilo. You saved for 3 months. For me? She held her daughter close, rocking slightly, and Lundergan turned away to give them privacy, his own eyes burning. When Irene finally composed herself, they sang Happy Birthday, all three of them off-key. Irene closed her eyes to make a wish. They ate cake with plastic forks, and it tasted better than any dessert at any five-star restaurant Lundergan had ever patronized. At 9 o'clock, Lundergan stood. I should go. You both need rest. Nilo walked him to the door, suddenly quiet. Then, without warning, she wrapped her small arms around his leg in a fierce hug. Thank you for being sad in the bakery, Papa Scott. The nickname dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Everyone froze. Nilo released his leg and stepped back, her face flushing red. Sorry, she mumbled, staring at her feet. I meant Mr. Scott, sorry. But Lundergan was already kneeling, lowering himself until he was eye level with this extraordinary child. Papa Scott is fine, he said, his voice rough with emotion. If your mama says it's okay. Nilo's head snapped up, hope blazing in her hazel eyes. She turned to her mother, the question written all over her face. Irene should say no. Should protect her daughter from attachment to a stranger who'd leave and never come back. But looking at Lundergan's face, at the vulnerability there, the desperate loneliness, she saw not a threat but a mirror of her own isolation. It's okay, she whispered. Lundergan stood slowly, nodded to Irene, and left before the tightness in his chest could break into something embarrassing. The elevator descended in silence. Marcus had the car door open, but Lundergan stood there on the cracked sidewalk, looking up at the lit window on the 4th floor. I've closed billion-dollar deals, he thought. I've built an empire, but nothing in 42 years has ever mattered as much as the last 3 hours. Lundergan told himself that was it. One evening, one good deed, one unexpected birthday. Now he'd return to his life. The penthouse with its view of everything and warmth of nothing. The office where he commanded respect, but never affection. 6 a.m. gym, 7 a.m. office, 10 p.m. return to empty rooms, repeat until retirement or death.